I'm Ronnie Eldridge, and welcome to Eldridge and Company. I'd like to talk about voting today, and there's no one better to talk with than my friend and leading election lawyer, Jerry Goldfeder. And I want Jerry to explain how we can stop state legislatures pervert our sacred act of voting. So, hello, Jerry.
Hi, it's good to see you, Ronnie.
It's a real crisis, I guess, because roughly I saw someplace 360 bills are to restrict voters are pending in at least 47 states. I mean, that's incredible.
It's a real crisis. There's no question about it. It's very serious. Our democracy is at stake and it's being challenged every day in various states, Republican-controlled state legislatures. They're doing two things. They are enacting laws that are restricting the right to vote by making it more difficult to vote as early voting, to make it more difficult to vote by mail, by setting up all sorts of restrictions relating to eating or drinking online. So the restrictive voting laws that are being put into place in the Republican states are going to suppress the vote. That's their goal. The fewer people vote, the better they think they have a chance to win. But they're doing something else as well. They're also something called election subversion, which is passing laws to enable partisan actors to take over the election administration. So, for example, in Georgia, they just passed a law that says that the legislative appointed election regulator can remove up to 4 county election officials. So what they really are trying to do then is to interfere with the actual counting of the votes. Take Fulton County in Georgia. That's the home of Atlanta. It's a hugely Democratic county. If they don't like the way the vote is going in Fulton County in Atlanta, they can replace the election administrator and essentially change the vote. So this kind of election subversion is very dangerous, putting partisans into positions of authority to actually alter the election results if they don't like them. Both of those things, restricting the right to vote and changing the actual totals. Those are the laws that are sweeping this country now, and it's very dangerous to our democratic institutions.
So have we ever had a universal, countrywide regulations or laws governing elections? So I mean, every state is, independent.
Every state is different. Every state has its own election code. Why? Because the founders in 1787 thought of a provision and inserted it in the United States Constitution that says that the states shall regulate their own elections. And that was part of the debates and the compromises during the founding Constitutional Convention. They gave a lot of authority to states. That's why we have a United States Senate where every state, big or small, has 2 votes. But regulating the elections is another thing that they did that really gave us what we have today. We're living with something that's from 230 years old, states regulating their own elections. But I want to say one other thing about this. That provision in the Constitution says states shall regulate their own elections, but I'm obviously paraphrasing, but the Congress can override that and pass standardized election laws. That's also in the Constitution. So we have, from time to time, the Congress has passed the voting rights law, motor voter, all sorts of protections that regulate federal elections nationwide. For the most part, states regulate their elections. Sometimes Congress steps in. And that's what Congress is trying to do now in passing a Voting Rights Act in Congress. It's being hotly debated both in the House and in the Senate. And that will at least rectify some of the problems that we're seeing when states are trying to restrict and subvert the votes. But it's only for federal elections, and it remains to be seen whether Congress has the will and has the votes to override some of these restrictive laws that are being put into place.
And the fact that it's stalled, really, because it was the first bill the House passed, HR 1, and it's stalled in the Senate, is one of the underlying problems that we're facing today, right? It's a Republican Party, a totally different party, obstructionist and everything else. And the
part of that
Senate.
Part of that is, the Democrats control the United States Senate, but you'd never know it because they have this filibuster. Yeah. By the way, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. The senators over years have developed this filibuster, basically by racist Southern senators way back when, in order to stop civil rights legislation. Well, that's what's going on now. We need 60 votes in order to stop a filibuster, which another way of putting that is, even though we have a 50-vote Democratic control of the Senate with the vice president casting the tie vote, casting the vote that breaks the tie, rather. So we have 51 votes. Even though we have that majority, a slim majority, we have the Republican senators not wanting to go along, and therefore they're using the threat of the filibuster and actually using the filibuster from time to time to stand in the way from the Senate going along with the House and passing voting rights legislation. Now, I have to say, Chuck Schumer from the great state of New York has said, we are going to do whatever is necessary to get these voting rights bills passed. And if anybody can do it, he can. He's really a terrific legislator. And they're working on it, and they're trying to create a bill that will actually get some Republican support.
But it also, by having to have a total, every Democrat vote, as well as the vice president, it allows nobody to deviate from that decision. And we see that now, with Manchin, and it's very difficult.
It's not the Democrats, it's just one or two so-called moderate Democrats or conservative Democrats that for some reason don't want to respect party discipline and pass the all-important Voting Rights Act.
Oh, I see. So that's why. All right. So
in this case, we want party discipline. We want the Democrats to stick together. But a guy like Manchin, he's a conservative Democrat. He comes from West Virginia. He has his own interests at heart. And it's been very difficult to persuade him to go along. Although I think Senator Schumer has really made some progress on this. And I think that we're going to see a bill pass in the near future.
Now, you said that the bill only applies to national elections, and we have to make people understand why they should vote. I mean, if the states control the rest of the election process, that means that all of these laws they're passing will be appropriate in a state election, which gives the Republicans a majority, which allows them to draw the lines and to pass all these crazy bills, right?
You said it. You're exactly right. So we want federal legislation to override these state laws in federal elections. We want people to understand that it's only for federal elections. So we also need to have mobilization so that people come out and vote and take over these states. Look, we can have federal legislation, we can have congressional legislation. It will be signed by President Biden. We can have litigation to try to challenge some of these restrictive voting rights laws, and we'll be able to win some of them because some of them are blatantly unconstitutional. But what we really need is political mobilization, because without that, we'll never be able to take over some of these states and change those laws. So it's really a three-pronged approach. It's federal legislation, it's litigation, but the key element here is mobilization, voting, but not just voting, really changing the political culture in many of these states.
we do that? I mean, how do we make people understand that when there's an election for a local school board, they better vote in it, or else the majority, if they don't agree with you, are going to decide the curriculum, are going to ban books, are going to tell teachers how they have to teach. I mean, it goes from the very local level. And we don't seem to be able, although more people have voted in the last election, right?
Yeah.
That was hopeful. But they don't understand what this democracy, how it's built, and what their responsibility is. I just don't understand that.
Well, it's a never-ending process. As we both know, it takes work and then more work to get people to understand, to get them involved, to keep them involved, for them to actually make change. It's a struggle. And frankly, there's no alternative but to continue to keep at it.
What has Stacey Abrams done in Georgia that she got the vote out?
Well, they worked on it for over a decade. They built up organization in all parts of Georgia. They registered a lot more voters, and they continued their contact with these voters over a prolonged period. They got them involved, and they kept them involved. And frankly, she is a smart, charismatic leader that was able to reach so many people in Georgia. And I think they've kept at it. And I think she's going to run again for governor of Georgia. And I think this time she might very well win.
Yeah. And so is this the national parties that should be starting it? It should be like, I mean, it should be like a candidate's primary campaign, really. You've got to have people out in the field to do this.
Absolutely. Well, Howard Dean, if you remember him, he's one of the guys who was definitely going to be president until he wasn't going to be president.
But he was the best chair of the party, I think.
But he was a great chair of the party, and he articulated what he called a 50-state strategy, which was really poo-pooed by a lot of the leaders in the major states. But it was smart. And really, that's what we need. We need a 50-state strategy because we need to organize everywhere, not just in swing states, but in states that you think you'll never win. It's a process. Look at Georgia. We just elected 2 United States senators who were Democrats. Well, that took a lot of work over a long period of time. That's what it takes. We have Democrats in Alaska, if you can believe it, who've been working hard for over a decade to try to capture a congressional seat in Alaska. You name the states that are really blue, like New York, we need to continue to work to keep it blue, but then we need to go into red states and purple states and do the work there as well. A state that's today is red can be tomorrow, can be purple, and can be blue. And you just got to keep that in mind because it's a never-ending process.
Yeah. You think we're going to see that in Texas with their gubernatorial election?
Well, I see that Beto O'Rourke is running, right, and he's very popular in parts of Texas. I don't know how I feel about him, but he might be the one who could really mobilize people to win there. Yeah. But again, Texas, aside from its awful anti-choice laws, has put in some really terrible restrictive voting laws that are very restrictive as well. So it's going to be a struggle there, but again, it's certainly worth the effort. And if anybody can do it, I bet you he can.
Yeah, I agree with you. Let's go to New York and the Democrats objecting to the nonpartisan redistricting. Does it make you feel a little nervous or upset that we're doing that?
Well, I don't know that anybody is objecting to nonpartisan redistricting. We have this so-called independent commission that is supposed to produce maps that take care of everybody's needs, if you will. But they produced 2 sets of maps, Republican and Democrat. Well, that doesn't help us. No. And they are authorized to go back to the drawing board and continue working on maps that could be acceptable to everybody. And if they don't, then the legislature will step in and draw its own maps. And this time, since Democrats control both the state Senate and the Assembly, they'll draw maps that will be helpful to the Democrats. You know, in the past, when the Republicans controlled the state Senate, the legislature couldn't agree, and so a court had to draw the maps for both congressional lines and state legislative lines. But now that the Democrats control both houses in Albany, they can draw maps that, objectively speaking, would be characterized as fair, or they can draw maps to make sure that Democrats control a greater number of representatives going to Washington, which is what we need to keep the majority in the House of Representatives. I have a feeling that's what's going to happen. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that.
You mentioned the Senate, and that I don't know if people totally understand that. I think is Wyoming a state that has one member of Congress?
As one member of Congress, but it has 2 senators.
Exactly. This uneven distribution is fascinating to me. And I guess if we were doing it again, we might, if we were drafting the Constitution, there might be a lot of pressure to do the same thing again.
Yeah, right? Yeah, absolutely. Look, we are shackled by our founders because they were so responsive to the needs of the states. The states control the presidential electors. The states control redistricting. The states control the United States Senate because every state has an equal amount of senators. You know, it's very interesting. You can amend the Constitution. It's very difficult to amend the Constitution. You need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to propose an amendment, and then you need 3/4 of the states to approve it. So we only have 27 amendments. And maybe it's good that it takes a lot to amend the Constitution. But believe it or not, there's one provision in the United States Constitution that says you need 100% of the states to amend this particular section. Which one? That each state has the same number of senators. So that can't be amended unless every state goes along with it. Well, who are we kidding? Is Wyoming ever going to decide to give up its equality with New York and California? I don't think so. And that's the way the founders wanted it, because they needed to get support of all the states in order to ratify what they did.
Did you go to law school because you wanted to get involved in electoral law, or did that happen afterwards?
I've always had an interest in politics, but I first got involved in election law because of a 1981 mayoral campaign where I was supporting a candidate who was trying to knock an opponent off the ballot so he would have a clear shot at the incumbent. I was supporting Frank Barbaro, and he was challenging Ed Koch in the Democratic Party primary. Koch was mayor at that time. And there was a third candidate, Melvin Klenetsky. And so we tried to knock him off the ballot. Well, I was like the young lawyer involved in that. I had no idea you could knock anybody off the ballot. I had no idea of any of that. All I know is I supported Frank Barbaro, but they roped me in to working at the Board of Elections, to volunteer at the Board of Elections, to look at all of his signatures to try to knock him off the ballot so Frank Barbaro could have a one-on-one shot against Ed Koch. And so I was astounded that there was such a thing. Nobody taught election law at the time, but little by little I'd learned it. And that was in 1981, and here we are 40 years later.
And now you're teaching election law.
Yeah.
And you've written the Bible, I guess, for New York State, right?
Yeah.
What's it called?
It's called Goldfeder's Modern Election Law. They allowed me to put my name in it because they didn't pay me anything for the book. Oh, for sure.
But you keep revising it, and everybody uses it. So it's a
absolutely. A lot of lawyers, a lot of judges use it. The next edition is coming out January 1st.
Oh, good. So how do you separate? I mean, you don't need to separate. You're always interested in who's running, right? Do you look for do you look for clients, or do they come to you? If you're
Well,
really
so
interested.
at this point in my life, the candidates come to me.
Yeah,
But there are some candidates or potential candidates who I reach out to who are very attractive, and I say, I really would like to work with that candidate, and I reach out. But for the most part,
yeah.
they reach me.
You wrote about the appointment of the new lieutenant governor.
Yes.
Do we have, is that written any place about how that happens? And
No, not at all. We've had 10 lieutenant governors who've acceded to the gubernatorial position. And when David Patterson did it, he was the first one to say, well, listen, I want to fill the lieutenant governor's position. All of his predecessors who became lieutenant governors, they just left the lieutenant governor position empty because we didn't have anything in the Constitution or any statute that allowed it to be filled. No special election, no appointment by the governor or anything like that. Governor Patterson was facing a state senate where there was a coup and it wasn't clear whether the Republicans were in charge or the Democrats were in charge. So he felt like he needed to fill the lieutenant governor position. So he appointed it. He appointed Richard Ravitch. And of course, that went to court because that's what we lawyers do. We go to court all the time. And the High Court, the New York State Court of Appeals, by a 4-3 vote said, yes, the governor has the authority to appoint a lieutenant governor. Now, so that's why Governor Hochul, now Governor Hochul, was able to appoint Brian Benjamin. My view has been we should do it the way they do it in the federal system. If the governor is going to appoint a lieutenant governor, then there should be a confirmation process. If you recall, when Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford became president, he appointed Nelson Rockefeller to be vice president. Nelson Rockefeller had to be confirmed by the House and by the Senate. Well, that's a good model. It allows the vice presidency to be filled, and it allows a role for the House and Senate. So it's not just this unitary act by a unilateral act, rather, by the governor with no other political actors playing a role. Well, we should do that in New York. The governor should be able to appoint a lieutenant governor when there's a vacancy, but there should be a confirmation process by the Assembly and the state Senate.
And can we only do that by amending the Constitution?
Yes.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in New York State, lieutenant governors run on their own. The federal system, they're part of the president's ticket. Well,
yes and no. The lieutenant governor runs on their own in the primary, but in the general election, the lieutenant governor and the governor run together.
Yeah, but they've both been nominated. I mean, they both won their primary.
They've both been nominated by their parties.
Yeah.
But then they run together.
But they get one vote between, one.
That's right. So you're voting. So let's say if Hochul and Benjamin are running for re-election, you can only vote for Hochul Benjamin. You can't vote for Hochul and not Benjamin, or vice versa.
Right, right.
You can do it in the primary, but in the general election, you only get one vote because they run as a ticket. And the same is true for president and vice president.
So you think that we're going to see some improvement and we're going to be able to stop some of these practices? As a final word.
I hope so. But it really depends on the persistence of the citizenry. It really depends on people in the United States taking hold of this democracy and making sure that it works.
Well, thank you. And I hope we've inspired some people, or at least informed them about their responsibility.
I hope so.
Thanks, Jerry.
Good to see you,
I hope to see you again.
Take care.